Hi, I'm Billy Hallowell, and welcome to Answering Atheists, a Pure Talk series brought to you by pureflix.com. I am excited today to be here with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. How are you?
Good, it's a real pleasure.
Now, you are a research biologist, you're a speaker, you work here at Answers in Genesis. Some people, some atheists would say, oh, science and faith, they can't go hand in hand. How would you respond to them?
Or what some journalists like to tell me. They'd say, you disagree with all of your scientific colleagues, is there some vast conspiracy, or do we throw out science? Poison door number one, poison door number two, knowing that either answer will make us look foolish, and I say there's a third answer. It's that most scientists aren't aware that there's a whole comprehensive, scientifically testable model that exists that explains the day equally well, if not better, than evolution. But we have an entire educational system that forbids teaching of any of that. And people can say conspiracy or not. That's just the way it is. It's an empirical fact. And most people I run into couldn't tell me what creationists believe. They're shocked when I say we've got testable predictions. It's just all so new, and they can't believe it's true. And part of that's because in their arsenal of arguments against creation, that's predicated on these things not being true. So there's a whole enterprise that has found its way into the cultural mainstream, into news organizations, journalists. All of this now is ready to be, is actually set up for a big shock when they find out what's actually going on.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that because you mentioned journalists, you know, there's media, there's the Hollywood factor too, and then universities and schools, not just universities, all the way down the line. It's almost like everywhere you learn, it's really been sort of poisoned against this idea that people aren't even hearing it.
Yes, yes. And I recently wrote a book to try to get this into the mainstream, and from cover to cover, literally, front cover to back cover, everything, we tried to make it such that no one's going to put this book down. No turn-offs, just everything to create curiosity, establish credibility, so that they'll turn the page at every stage. And what I've discovered is there's these cultural barriers that have been erected, these almost impenetrable walls, that as soon as they find out just the fact you're a creationist, end of discussion. No one's
They're not even going to have you on, no interview,
nope. Not even going to crack the book. They're loath to even pay money to buy the book. And so that's not something I expected to see, to have it so entrenched. Our opponents have done an excellent job creating a culture in which just that mention is a conversation stopper. And I can even think of an example when I was in Boston at a church, and the pastor had me come back and speak, and he said, and he's a young earth creationist, but he said, could you maybe save that for the end, or make that a lesser part of your lecture? Because he knows, and especially in Boston, the more liberal parts of the country, 6,000 years as a conversation stopper. It's become equivalent to flat earth. It's become equivalent to anything that you name that people think is ridiculous. So even if your goal is to simply question evolution, if you mention 6,000 years, that's the code word for, oh, this guy's a lunatic. So that's not something I appreciated, just because I've grown up with, of course this is true. And so to discover there's a whole culture that's been erected against this to such an extent you can't even talk about it, that's mind-boggling to me.
Well, and it does seem like I think that's where we are in culture right now, just having conversations about things. It's become very easy to say, oh, you don't agree with me. And when one side has that power, it's very easy when you have Hollywood media universities to push it out. And then nobody's even heard it. So the mere mention of this discussion is crazy to them. Like, why would we allow it? Instead of saying, okay, well, if we think you're crazy, well, let's sit down and talk about it. What's the harm in having that conversation, right?
In a sense, you could almost say that they've applied evolution to the discussion. So it's not an equal exchange of ideas and let's see which one is right. It's survival of the fittest. So if you're in power, it doesn't matter.
Except they've rigged the whole system.
Yes, now they're in the power, they're the fittest survive, and it doesn't matter what anyone else says. We're not going to give them the time of day. Once you have power, you can discuss it. That's what it comes down to at the end of the day.
Let's talk a little bit about Replacing Darwin, the New Origin of Species. This is the book.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about the book, the goal, what you're hoping people take away from it.
Yes. I wrote the book I wish I had when I was a student to hand to my unbelieving or evolutionary classmates. Something that they could pick up, that there's nothing that would turn them off, in the sense of when I wrote it, I made sure, and I had a picture of someone in that category, basically, an unbeliever, so I can look at them and always be reminded they don't know anything about the Bible, they don't assume anything about the Bible, they're not asking questions about the Bible, they're not asking questions about creation. Darwin settled it. So I have to find a way on every page to make them think, oh, wait a minute, that's not something I thought of. Maybe I should reconsider this, or that challenges what I took for granted, so that they have to keep turning and slowly reveal an answer to them, show them answers, instead of maybe telling them and being in your face about it. I have to sort of lure them into this topic, and by the end of the book have them say, whoa, I never saw this coming. I didn't know that there was so much scientific evidence against what I was saying and in support of another idea. There's good scientific evidence for the creation model. What we've been told in the court system is wrong. So many of those points will come through, and really that was my goal, to have a comprehensive one-stop. We're going to take you where you are right now. Yes, evolution is true. Going to take you where you are right now, even if you don't know anything about genetics, which is really where the debate's at, and walk you through 10 chapters of science, put the gospel at the end, take them from A to Z, and show them where the debate's really at today.
Now, when we look at misconceptions, right, we're talking about people not having knowledge, not knowing about this other side, this other point of discussion. But when it comes to creation, you had said people don't even know what creationists believe. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions about creation?
There's so many, but here's what comes to mind first, having read so many of their books and thinking about the few times, because they don't do it much, the few times they try to engage creation science. And the typical view, again, if they touch it, most of them just try to ignore it and don't even deal with it. It's religion, so let's not talk about it. They treat it as if we're still in 1859. What's the 1859 creationist view? It's the one that Darwin tried to push against. You can get a sense for it just by reading his book. How does he treat his opponents? His opponents in his book are people who think God creates every species in its current location, which doesn't at all fit the idea of God destroying the whole planet with a flood 4,500 years ago. But that's what they viewed, erroneous, unbiblical view. And that's a fairly easy view to scientifically demolish. I can easily scientifically demolish that view. It doesn't come from the scripture either. And so that gives rise to all sorts of misconceptions about the ark. Well, no way you can fit millions of animals on board the ark. That's foolish. Well, of course, if that's what you think is what the Bible teaches, it's not. What the scriptures actually teach is that God creates kinds. These are not species, not even the next level of classification, genus, but family. So dogs, wolves, coyotes, foxes are all part of the same family, even though they're separate species. Noah brings two of that family on board the ark. A whole bunch of species form after the flood. That's a huge difference from what Darwin proposed. It effectively renders nearly all of his arguments against creation useless. So he's got a bunch of arguments that demolish God creating species. They don't apply to this kinds view. And so Richard Dawkins coined, all these people aren't aware of this, and continue to repeat evidences, because the evolutionary evidences are largely unchanged since Darwin, that don't apply to the modern debate. Science is a process of disproving things. Darwin disproved the old creationist idea. He did not disprove the modern idea, which means we're on a level playing field again. And so all these evidences you find in textbooks, you find in popular books, those do not disprove creation, which means you can't use it in support of evolution. If you're in a crime scene and two suspects are equally indicted, you've got to look for some other evidence to figure out who did it. The same is true in this case.
This might sound like, I'm not a scientist, so I'm going to ask this question. Now, when we talk about kinds, let's say a male and a female dog, some kind of dog are brought on the ark, they come off after. How does that process work? Because obviously there's micro and macro evolution, I would assume. So can you just explain, so then how do you end up with different, when those kinds come off, different kinds off of that, if that makes sense, different species?
One of the best illustrations of this comes from Darwin himself. His opening chapters that few people like to talk about today for some reason I don't understand, but they're great arguments. He compares what happens in farms, in pet stores, to what happens in the wild. So let's use the dog family. There's, I think, just over 30 species of wolves and foxes, coyotes, so forth, alive today. Dog breeds, what we have in our homes, what we've set our minds to mixing. And so when humans have set their minds to just mixing and matching, males and females, taking the genetic diversity that already exists and producing bigger versions, smaller versions, long-haired, short-haired, red-colored, brown-haired, so forth, all of that just by reshuffling what exists, because no one's going in there and microscopically changing the DNA with a pipette or with some sort of new technology. We're just taking what exists and picking the parents. We've produced all of these breeds in a short amount of time from what exists. So that's now an argument from the greater to the lesser. All of this variety just by mixing and matching on the farm in our homes. You go to the wild, there's less diversity. There's less variety in the wild than what we see on the farms. So it's all that much easier for these guys just to mix and match parents by chance, by spreading out around the globe. The same type of processes apply there as on the farm. They have a whole bunch of genetic diversity we can't see. It's just basic Mendelian genetics. It's dominance and recessive. You think of red hair, you can have red-haired children from parents who do not have red hair because it can be in a recessive state, a hidden state basically. You multiply that by 1,000,000-fold, because we can do that now. We know that's true based on the DNA sequences that we have. There's all sorts of hidden genetic potential in these creatures, and we know that's now true for a fact now that we have their DNA. So it's just a matter of mixing and matching it. Let's say that one set of parents goes off to Asia, one goes off to Africa. They're taking some genetic potential with them, and over time it emerges. That's what gives rise to new species. That's something we can elaborate on with much more detail today because we have DNA, but we can see the hint of that even in Darwin's day by what we've been able to do on the farm and pet shops and so forth.
Well, it's interesting he writes about that.
Yes,
right.
exactly.
That's really fascinating. Thank you for explaining that. Now, so what do you say to somebody who says 6,000 years is crazy, it's billions of years, what do you say to that person how would you start to approach them and say, listen, this is why you need to think about this over here, this other idea?
I would give two answers. And I would have given a different answer 10 years ago versus today. And the reason for that is because we've made tremendous advances in genetics on this issue, so that, in my mind, and this is maybe why I'm so shocked by people thinking this term itself, 6,000 years, is a pariah, something, a bad word, a dirty word almost, because it's just so ridiculous. There is so much genetic evidence for 6,000 years that I don't even give it a second thought. So, for example, this is what many people don't realize, even evolutionists don't realize. We have in all of our cells, with few exceptions, DNA, and every generation, sperm and egg pass on DNA. The DNA changes. There's mistakes that happen. We live in an imperfect world. It's not copied perfectly. Well, that means it's a regular process, and so to have a clock, all you need is a regular repeating process. Every generation, changes happen. So we don't appreciate it because we live, we see 2, 3 generations, we die. Well, you add this up over several hundred generations, there's a history that's recorded. And so if we look at the DNA of people around the globe, we look at the DNA of animals around the globe, how many differences exist, how fast does it change, we've got a clock, a mathematical calculation we can use and say, do humans look young? Do we have a lot of genetic differences? Has the clock been ticking for a long time or a short time? And over again, what we see in our DNA is abundant evidence there isn't enough DNA differences for us to have been around hundreds of thousands, millions of years. It looks like we arose just 6,000 years ago. And I think most people will be shocked by that and floored by it. And I can make that argument even stronger. So let me give this background. You go back 40 years in the creation-evolution debate. What's the main argument against creation? What's ensconced in federal law? Why can't creation science be taught in the classroom? Well, it's not science. It doesn't make testable predictions. That's flat out false. We have now predictions in genetics. We've met the gold standard of science, which is hardly anyone is aware of this.
But does evolution have testable?
They claim it to be true.
But can you really test it? You couldn't recreate it. I mean, it would seem like that's the same standard they would have to be held to if that was something.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the way they phrase it, the way they apply it, is maybe the better way to say it, is there are certain expectations they have if evolution were true. In practice, it's a really plastic theory. And I can give examples of evolutionists from the 50s saying, well, we know evolution's been going on for millions of years, and so it's hopeless to find shared DNA among species. It's just been going on for too long. Mistakes have been happening too long. That's a prediction, expectation of evolution. Lo and behold, we find that mice and fruit flies use a similar section of DNA to build their eyes, even though a fruit fly has a compound eye and a mouse has an eye like ours. Well, we've just falsified evolution, haven't we? We've just found the opposite of what evolutionists have expected. No, that's now the textbook evidence for common ancestry. So evolution predicts one thing, the opposite is found. Well, now that's the fulfillment of the prediction of evolution. And these sorts of things happen below the radar in technical journals, and most people don't see it, but this is the reality of evolution. And really, evolution isn't testable. It isn't predictable. If it can explain polar opposite conclusions and both of them be confirmation of evolution, you can't have it both ways, is really what it comes down to. But evolutionists want to have it both ways, and they call those predictions when in fact evolution is an idea that after the fact explains everything. And of course, if you can explain everything after the fact by storytelling, you don't explain anything.
Right, it's just a theory, which is right. It's a theory essentially of how you think something happened, right?
Yeah.
So Adam and Eve. Let's just talk about this briefly, because it is interesting when you talk to atheists, the assumption that it's absurd, and even there are Christians who fall in the camp of, oh, Genesis is not to be taken literally. But when we talk about Adam and Eve, two human beings at the start that were created, that we all flow from, in your mind, do we have evidence that that is something that happened, that truthfully happened?
We have, I would even go as far as say we have overwhelming evidence that this is true. And we can see this from multiple genetic angles. And actually, let me back up. The place we should look for this, where should we look for the evidence for Adam and Eve? The creation-evolution debate has been dominated by fossils, by geology, by all sorts of other fields of science, anatomy, embryology, everything but genetics for 150 years by and large. And that's for historical reasons. We didn't discover the structure of DNA. We didn't know DNA is where genetics is found until 1953. The term genetics wasn't even around when Darwin wrote his book. That's how primitive our understanding was. But that's what's inherited in sperm and egg. Sperm and egg don't pass on a fossil. They don't pass on a bone or a hand. They pass on an instruction manual. So if you want to find the history of humanity, that's where you got to look. And we have clocks in our DNA that go back 6,000 years that easily fit two people. Where the debate really is, and where the evolutionists go to say, well, you can't have two people, is the DNA that's inherited from both parents. So I'm a mix of my parents. You can see that in my physical features, which ultimately go back to my DNA. Dad passes on half, mom passes on half. And I have within my cells two different versions of DNA. So that's how DNA can be hidden. Well, most people, evolutionists, assume every difference I have within my body, every difference between me and you, is ultimately the result of mistakes over time. Well, if you look within my body, within my cells, and you look at the DNA of my parents, the differences within my cells, most of them, the vast majority of them, are not the result of mistakes from mom and dad. To put numbers on it, about 80 of the differences in my cells are due to mistakes from mom and dad. Millions of them are simply inherited. So what if you go back to Adam and Eve? Would God create Adam and Eve? Would God create Adam with two identical versions of DNA and Eve the same way? You can run sort of this mental experiment. If that's true, they would essentially produce clones, genetically identical offspring to them, and that's weird to me. I don't think God would create the world that way. You know, go be fruitful and clone yourselves. Be fruitful and multiply. I think the best evidence, and to me theologically this makes more sense, God creates Adam and Eve with differences from the start, with the appearance of parents. And that's not deceptive, because God can create any which way he wants to. I don't think God creates Adam as a zygote, a fertilized egg. He creates him as an adult, so he can work the garden, that sort of thing. And that's not deceptive, because God tells him how he created him. And Adam is created, I think, as an adult to do the work of the garden, to honor God and glorify him in that way. So why wouldn't God create Adam as an adult parent with differences in his DNA, Eve with differences in hers? They could produce all the races and so-called races of humanity in one generation, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, all that, and genetics supports that. And the reason evolutionists argue against that view, they don't actually argue against what I've just said. They argue against the existence of the couple. They don't even consider the possibility that God creates Adam and Eve genetically diverse. Well, because that's a divine act, and we can't allow that in our scientific discussions, even though it makes testable predictions, and we can see the ramifications of this in people around the globe today.
Shifting gears just a little bit as we round to a close here, I'm curious for you what it was that drove you into both the worlds of science and faith.
For me, I grew up in a Christian home, in a young earth creation home. I was homeschooled through 8th grade, went to a small Christian high school, the only school in the area that explicitly said we're a young earth school. And I guess you could say I read double all my growing up years. Knew the evolutionary view, knew the creation view, so when I went off to college was prepared. There were no surprises in the classroom, which I think every student who wants to go off to college, you have to have that preparation. Otherwise, you're going to be overwhelmed by the depth of the evolutionary arguments that you hear And we hear so many sad testimonies of that after the fact. Even though I had that strong upbringing, I don't know that I was born again until about halfway through graduate school. I lived in sin, looking at pornography for so many years, knew the gospel, knew I was to live a pure life, but didn't see the connection. It was old news, in a sense, the gospel was, not good news. And just through sitting with the scriptures for over a period of several weeks, for reasons I can't explain, because that's usually how salvation happens, the gospel became good news, could see the beauty of holiness, could see the majesty of God's characteristics. And okay, this is what makes the Christian life attractive. This is the hope of heaven. The joy of eternity is being in His radiant presence. And that's, I think, what God has to open everyone's eyes to, for them to be born again. And that also shifted my focus from maybe a mainstream scientific career, academia, working on cancer, to what can I do scientifically that's maybe more of a direct ministry application. So I started out with the Institute for Creation Research, worked there 6 years doing research on genetics and the origin of species and human origins. Have continued that now, and it's just sort of a kid in the candy shop now. We can now look back through human history with DNA. We can solve historical mysteries. We can, the project I'm working on right now is the pre-Columbian history of the Americas, that are rewriting things that no secularist is ever going to set their mind to. It's just crazy stuff. So much so that I even sat down recently and thought to myself, there's so many questions I want to answer, and then it struck me, I'm never going to answer them all before I die. Which is sort of depressing, but also reminded me of sort of my own conversion experience, that I went into this knowing Luke 16, use what you have to win eternal friends. So there's so many research questions to do, but at some point you also have to say, let's train the next generation. There's people who have to come after you. There's eternal friends to win, which happens through research, but also through direct mentorship. And so these are the things I'm keeping in mind now, looking forward to the second half of my life. And to eternity, what can I accomplish with what I've been given before the Lord calls me home for maximum eternal joy and maximum eternal joy of the people I come in contact with.
Well, and you spoke a little bit about about sort of equipping. There's a little discussion about equipping the next generation too. You're talking about, you're not going to be able to answer all these questions before you die, and there's a whole other generation coming up that behind you, and some of the stats for Generation Z are a little scary.
Yes.
And so there's a big responsibility for us to impart wisdom, and for you to impart wisdom in your ministry work on the next generation. Now, you went to Harvard, correct? Mm-hmm. And the reason I bring that up is because when we think of Harvard, we think of big, famous, well-known, great secular school. And yet you came from this faith background. And so I think there's a lot of young people going into the world, going into schools like Harvard, and they're losing their faith. They're not finding that. You had the opposite experience, right?
Yeah.
Of finding your faith later on, really finding it after the upbringing you had. What would you say to parents who might be watching, whose kids maybe are in college, or maybe in 10 years they're going to go to college, but how do we equip them based on your experience?
3 things come to mind. One is it's essential for students to read double. And I look around at what churches have done, parents have done, how many students are still going off to secular college and falling away. Well, there are a handful of young earth schools, but I think still so many are going off to secular college. You have to have read double. I'm hoping Answers in Genesis, I've been in discussions currently trying to establish some sort of college prep program where, look, if no one else is doing it, we're going to take your students for a summer and we're going to sit down, we're going to read double. We don't have to read all the biology textbooks because 90% of it doesn't have to do with origins. We're going to sit and focus laser-like. You're going to go into biology. Let's read the biology. Let's read Richard Dawkins' Jerry Coyne. Let's read the creationist materials. Let's read the materials of theistic evolutionists. Let's read the academic theological arguments you're going to run into at InterVarsity and other places that are going to give you maybe a different view, so that you go off. It's not a surprise. You're prepared, and you can take the discussion to your peers. You can take the discussion to your professors in a winsome and discreet way, because students aren't paying to hear you talk, they're paying to hear the college professor talk, but there's ways to raise questions in class. That's essential. You have to read double. Secondly, you have to be connected to a local church. I was in a church, and actually when I first got to Boston, one of my housemates said, you need to go to a church that you can walk to. He was a chemistry guy, a postdoc in a lab, and he said, look, if you're in lab late and you got to hop on the subway for 45 minutes, you're not going to go. You're going to stay in lab. But if you can walk to church, you're going to go. And that, I think, was instrumental for me. I was at a church I could easily get to. That was a lot of peers who held me accountable, encouraged me, were there with me. There was this time I was suicidal at one point in graduate school. All of that is essential. And thirdly, just a prayer support. Having a strong Christian upbringing and people who supported me back home in Wisconsin, even though I was out east. All of those together are critical, I think, and maybe even a fourth one, not just scientific, but a strong theological upbringing. There's so many temptations. Harvard has the primal scream, I learned. I didn't live on the undergraduate side, but apparently there's a tradition where in the winter everyone gets naked and runs around campus. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's crazy stuff, and that was 10, 15 years ago. I don't know what they're doing now, but
probably worse.
I think most parents don't realize the level of depravity. Here's the story, another story. I went on my college visit trip. They put me up, and I roomed with a fellow Wisconsinite who was a second-year graduate student, and I heard about the seminars and the retreats and such when I came there that fall. I said, what happens at these retreats? And he wasn't a believer. He thought about it for a minute. He said, debauchery. I said, that's good to know, thank you. But that's the way the world works, and it's not advertised. That's not what they show you in the campus visit.
You have to be aware
That's
of it.
What's coming, exactly.
And we appreciate you sharing your wisdom on all these topics, but also on that, because I think that's important for parents and families.
Yes.
And thank you for coming down today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in. You can go to facebook.com/pureflix and pureflix.com for more daily inspiring content.
With over 10,000 titles, it would be impossible for us to show you everything on pureflix.com. But let's give it a shot.